Conference Monitor has three main panels: the timeline of the tweets, the tag clouds of the hashtags, green color for new hashtags, and brown for the old ones. Finally, the participant table, showing the participants who tweeted about that conference. We can also see all the raw tweets. Now I will show how Conference Monitor was used. During the conference Theorizing the Web, the timeline view shows that morning sessions generated more conversation, and right after lunch break, the participation was the lowest. So if you are a speaker, it might not be a good idea to schedule your talk right after the lunch break. Now let's imagine you are the organizer and you want to know about your sessions. So using this drop-down menu, we can select a particular session. So I select the opening session, and now the timeline and all the other views will show only the tweets from those sessions. But here's the fact: in this conference there were several presentations happening at the same time in different rooms. So we asked people to use the room number as a hashtag when they're tweeting about their talks in that room. So during the opening session, the hashtag B1, C1, D1 were very popular because they indicate the room number. But interestingly, the talks from room B1 gained more attention in the back channel than the talks in room D1. So what happened? Does it mean that the presentation in room D1 were not very interesting? Let's check. I select B1, and now the table is filtered, showing only the participants who tweeted from room B1. And I add the timeline of those tweets. For comparing, I also select room D1, and everything is filtered, and I see that 24 people tweeted from room D1. And I add the timeline, which is now shown in orange color. Another interesting thing about this conference was a lot of people who were not present in the conference in person were following this conference by watching the live streaming of the presentation, and they are very active in Twitter. So, as an organizer, it will be very interesting to see what those people were talking about. So now, using this filtering in the table, I can select only those remote participants, and I see that there were more than 300 people who are not present but talking about that conference. I want to see who was the most active remote participant. So I sort by total number of tweets. I see that this person, Jeffrey Kiefer, tweeted the most. I want to select only his tweets, and I add the timeline, and I see that he was very active during most of the conference, but in the last session he was not active anymore. Interestingly, the last session was the keynote session, which is one of the main focus of a conference. Let's see what happened in the keynote session. So I select keynote, and now I see the tweets from only the keynote session. Who was mentioned by most people in the keynote session? So I sort the table by mention by column, and I see that, and interestingly, A. Carvin was the keynote speaker, but he was not the most mentioned one. In fact, he was the second most mentioned person. I can add the timeline of the tweets that mention the keynote speaker, which is represented using orange line, and the most mentioned person was the person who interviewed the keynote speaker, and she was mentioned the most because people were sending her questions so she can ask those questions to the keynote speaker. Now I add her tweet timeline, and this is represented in green, and I see that during the middle of the talk the keynote speaker himself was mentioned the most.